This is Flywire's update to the Ukrainian war in the air and on the ground, number 3. Hey, I'm Scott Perdue, and today on Flywire, we're going to talk about the state of the Ukrainian air war, in the air and on the ground. And there's some pretty interesting things happening. One of which is late breaking news is that it sounds like Turkey is brokering a negotiation peace deal between Russia and Ukraine. We'll see. So what I've suggested in previous video, the first video that I did on this, is pretty much playing out in Ukraine right now. And we're going to talk a little bit about that as we go along. But I think the big news is how the Ukrainian army has changed the game, and even mostly that they had enough strength to do it in the first place. I think that's pretty amazing. So I want to show a couple of satellite photos here that show ground fires around Kyiv. The sole road in this area that comes down around Chernobyl from Belarus is, they call it M07, and the Russians are using that as a supply route. And I believe that this is the road that had the stalled 40-mile convoy on at the very beginning for so long. The Russians are road-bound, and this gives the Ukrainians freedom of action in the woods and territory in between, and I think that's critical. What they're doing is they're interdicting supply convoys and troop concentrations where they can, using small units and then with various anti-tank weapons, and realize that these are ambushes at close range. We're talking, 100 yards, maybe as much as a half mile, but not much more than that. And if the ambush goes badly, well, the infantry unit's going to be hard-pressed to get out of the killing zone. They're going to be the targets. So it takes courage and a lot of chutzpah to face off an armed vehicle, even with a javelin, I'm telling you. So one observation here is that the infantry-borne anti-tank weapon is not a new thing. I've heard it so many times that people seem to think that this stuff is new technology and the age of the tank is over. Well, the American bazooka, the British Piat, the German Panzerfaust of World War II were all effective. The Panzerfaust had a shaped charge. I think it was the first one with a shaped charge. Not sure about that. It was fairly simple. I mean, really simple. And in my opinion, it was the grandfather of today's RPG. In World War II, you had to be within about 100 yards. And then later on, the AT-4 was slightly better than the bazooka, and then the Javelin, the latest Javelin and the In-Law, way better than the Dragon and some of the others, and they have better range and a better warhead. But all of them, their effective range really is less than about a half mile. And when you're on your feet, that's pretty damn close. When you're facing somebody else in a tracked vehicle or a cannon, you have to have an effective exit planned, and that drives a more complicated ambush plan to support the trigger pullers. You got to have somebody else suppressing fire to get those guys out. Courage indeed, but not new weapons. More effective? Yeah, sure, but it's not the end of the tank, in no way. So here's the other one, is mud is a factor. But it's always been a factor for off-road operations, unless, it's minus 20 degrees outside. The ground is tundra. I think the Russians are sticking to the roads mostly because of their mobility issues and increased vulnerability when off-road. And this is directly supported by the number of vehicles that are being lost. Believe whatever numbers you want to believe, but the Russian losses are very large. Justin Bronk of the think tank RUSI in the UK was on the BBC yesterday, and he said that the Russians still have 90% of their forces they invaded Ukraine with. Doesn't sound like huge losses, right? When you put it that way. Let's put numbers to it. Russia mustered 120 battalion tactical groups, or BTGs, for the invasion, and the entire Russian army can only put out 160 BTGs in the field. That makes 75% of their forces are committed to the invasion. A BTG fields a company of 10 tanks, 3 mechanized infantry companies, each with about 10 tracked BMPs or 10 wheeled BTRs. Other support platoon-sized units with AFEs mounted with grenade launchers, /mortars, and anti-tank weapons, things like that. Well, and command vehicles add in there. The estimates of Russian forces committed was an easy reach because we had satellite photos of the forces being marshaled before the invasion. So that recce puts the number of tanks at about 1,200 to start with, and at about 4,800 armored fighting vehicles in total. I think this is that it's important to pick up from the footage of destroyed tanks and even the British in-law or the U.S. Javelin ambushes, that the Russian infantry is not supporting the tanks the way mechanized infantry in the West does. It appears that Russians operate on the battlefield like they were in exercise convoys, tanks and tanks like this, and trucks, and all crammed up like they're training. They're training areas back home. Convoys are bunched and in a parade formation rather than traveling in a hostile battlefield, spaced out and ready to defend. Ever since the tank was first used in World War I, it's been vulnerable to dismounted infantry. And the only way to counter that is with your own infantry. And that's not happening in Ukraine. And whether the Russians have lost 500 tanks or 120, this tactical employment is a huge weakness of the Russian army. It's a big reveal, frankly. The question is will they fix it in time? Will they address it before they chew up everything they have or sue for peace or, level Ukraine? I think Brock has a really good handle on the air war, and he's very conservative on the ground war. But if his observation of 10% losses holds true, it will equate to losing about 19,000 men, 120 tanks, and 480 armored fighter vehicles of other types. I think the numbers are likely higher, but at this point, neither side is reporting accurately. And frankly, I can't blame them. But if 10% losses are an accurate number, then the truth of it, that these losses are enormous. Let's get a little perspective. The Americans, the British, and the Canadians landed 132,000 troops on the Normandy beaches on D-Day. That's on the day. The losses were severe at 3,400 killed. Whole units were rendered non-effective. There were so many men lost. It was terrible. When you calculate that loss rate for the Allies, it was about 2.5%. In November 1943, Tarawa saw the bloodiest battle with an 8.3% loss rate of Marines, and in February 1945, in the Battle of Iojima, the Marines posted a loss rate of 9.7%. That's simply devastating. In fact, Iojima was so bad the American government concealed the actual losses until well after the war was over because they thought it would destroy civilian morale. Simply put, 10% losses of men and equipment is unsustainable. It is. This is a big deal, no matter where the actual numbers fall. Even 5% is huge. The other thing that is important to note is that the combat arms of any army are never more than a fraction of the army itself. Reportedly, the Russian army comprised 900,000 active personnel, and they committed 200,000 or so to Ukraine. That's a huge fraction of their capability overall, especially of their combat capability, the tooth-to-tail ratio. They committed 75% of their armored strength, and with these losses, time is running out. I think the Russian field commanders realized that and stopped the strategy of trying to overwhelm the country of Ukraine across a broad front that we've seen. Everything's been stagnant that we've observed over the last couple of weeks. They now seem to be attempting to encircle Kyiv, or were trying to do that, and then invest the city of Mariupol. The concentration seems to be at Mariupol right now, and if they could force the surrender of that city, it would free up forces for Odessa and then Kharkiv and then on to Kyiv. Mariupol is pretty much holding out. There were 2 brigades of the Ukrainian army there before the war. I guess they might have been pretty well prepared for this action. Otherwise, how can you explain them holding out? It seems to be about 100,000 people left there at this point. But this new strategy has stalled the rest of the Russian operations in Ukraine, and the Ukrainian army does not have the capability to relieve Mariupol. Go back to those satellite photos of fires north and northwest of Kyiv. They show a clear demarcation line that coincides with the Russian front lines and supports the Ukrainian MOD claim that they are retaking positions from the Russians. There is a real chance that they might cut off a portion of Russian troops, and that could relieve the pressure on Mariupol. Maybe that's the strategy. The Russians can always fall back on Belarus, but that would affect the entire war in the north and the east. Well, not the east, but the north and the west. On the air war side of the Ukrainian airspace continues to be a lethal place to fly, and both sides seem to be concentrating on night operations, and neither side has been able to counter opposing SAMs, surface-to-air missiles. The Ukraine medium-range SAMs are denying the use of medium altitudes to the Russians, which forces them to low level. strikes with unguided munitions, and they don't train with that stuff. They don't typically fly at night, and they're not equipped for any precision stuff, so they're just generally bombing stuff. They do seem to be putting up as many as 200 sorties a day. If they're not effective, well, it doesn't really matter. The Ukrainians are in a worse position than they have fewer airplanes and are operating off of roads, and I can't help but believe that their combat power has to be dwindling quickly in those conditions. Rough fields that they're not really prepared to operate off of. Logistically, it's a nightmare. The Ukrainians claimed about 11 shoot-downs on 23 March and 8 more on 24 March, airplanes and helicopters and UAVs. The Russians are pretty much silent about that. Reports are that Russia has fired 1,200 ballistic missiles, which is about 50% of the stock they started with. And a Ukrainian Air Force AN-124 transport landed at a Turkish airport where the Bayraktar drone is exported on the 23rd of March. So one supposes they're buying more of them as well as ammunition. There are anecdotal reports of massive rearmament shipments to Ukraine that no one in the news is reporting, and that's probably a good thing. In order to be effective with their new strategy at Kyiv, with the stalled Russians there, they would have to be receiving supply at tremendous rates. In this kind of war, you chew up equipment, and sometimes people. You do people. Please understand that the Ukrainian offensive around Kyiv, for the most part, is not a classic force-on-force battle. To the northwest, the Ukrainian army is launching small-scale attacks at weak areas of the Russian front behind the lines, doing as much as they damage as they can, and then they withdraw before the Russians can mount a counterattack. The main effect is to force the Russian artillery back and out of range of Kyiv. With their supply lines becoming vulnerable, this puts the whole Russian combined arms army northwest of Kyiv in a precarious position. That situation is exacerbated by the Ukrainian offensive to the east of Kyiv, and that's kind of more of a force-on-force. About 4 days ago, the Ukrainian army attacked the Russian flank, forcing the 2nd Guards Combined Arms Army to withdraw back to the Supply River, I think was what you said, liberating several villages. And that put a stop to the threat on Kyiv from the eastern front at this point, at least for a time. I think this might be the first force-on-force battle in open fields between the Russians and the Ukrainians that we've heard about, at least that I've heard about. The Kharkiv area is fairly quiet, but the Russians are bombing and shelling the town at will and pursuing that level strategy, but apparently not actively engaging with troops and tanks. A town near there, Iojima, has, pardon my pronunciation, has been attacked by the 144th Motorized Rifle Division for about the last 5 days. And it looks like the Ukrainian brigade there is holding their own so far. The Russian 42nd Guards Motorized Rifle Division was badly mauled in its attack on Zhytomyr, and this has stalled the advance from the south. In Mariupol, the Russians have reached the drama theater that was all in the news and that they bombed on the 16th March, and they killed between 300 and 400 people in the basement. Reports are that 7,000 citizens of Mariupol were deported by the Russians over the last 2 days. With the Russians approaching the center of town, it probably means the worst for the residents of that city, but Ukrainian forces are still holding out in various parts of the city, and they're demanding help with Russian air, as the majority of civilian deaths are being caused by indiscriminate Russian bombing. Remember, I said they don't have precision weapons, and they're not used to operating in the environment that they're flying in, so they just drop a bomb on stuff. People happen to be there. In the port of Berdyansk, I think it is, a Russian amphibious ship has caught on fire. The fire destroyed one ship and 2 others were damaged. Ukrainians are claiming that strike, but apparently it was a fire started during unloading. At least that's what some people are saying. The trouble with that concept is that at least one of the damaged ships was not docked right next to the destroyed ship. And it's hard to see the truth here, but the loss was real. The loss in manpower and equipment has essentially put a stop to the Russian advance on Odessa, and that's good for the Ukrainians. The Russians in Kherson are being hard-pressed, and apparently there's a fight going on there. They're being hard-pressed by the Ukrainians, but the Ukrainians are being held at bay by Russian airstrikes at that point. On 22 March, there was a fratricide incident where a Russian airstrike bombed a Russian column of vehicles and destroyed the entire column. The Ukrainians attacked the Russians at Kherson Airport with a very large multiple launch rocket system, MLRS barrage. But one thing I found very interesting here was a report, and I think it's important, of over 300,000 refugee Ukrainians that have re-entered the country, apparently to fight or support the fighters in the field. Who knows what training they've received and what weapons they brought back with them. But 300,000, that's a pretty big number. That's a pretty big infusion. The air war is proceeding along, but it really still doesn't look like it's going to be decisive in this entire war. Some NATO countries are looking at shipping Ukrainian SAMs that they're used to, the S-300s, etc., for the U.S., if the U.S. backfills with Patriots. So we'll see what happens. Massive amount of equipment is flowing into Ukraine, and so they're still in the fight, and they're still doing grave damage to the Russians. As long as they stay in the fight, the Russians cannot win. I think we'll hear more talk about that negotiation I mentioned in the near future. We'll see. It all depends on Russia's readiness to, have we achieved our goals? Can they back out of it? Can they? From a morale standpoint, there was a report of a Russian colonel of the 37th Separate Guard Motorized Rifle Battalion attributed, that's supposedly an elite unit. It was run over by a tank driver upset with the 50% losses experienced in the unit. The colonel appears to have lost his legs, but has survived. That's kind of interesting. Ukrainians are using facial recognition software to identify the bodies of fallen Russian troops, and then they're using that information to backtrack to their families and then notifying them via social media. Apparently the Russians aren't notifying anybody. To me, this has elements of a propaganda campaign, and it's a little disturbing. I'm not sure how to feel about that yet. That's kind of brutal warfare, psychological warfare. There are people out there trying to actively ferret out the truth as to what is happening in this war. NATO is estimating over 40,000 Russian casualties in the war so far. That includes killed, wounded, and missing. A large number of the dead have been left behind for Ukrainians recovered, Russian dead. So they have some accurate numbers. Whether they're sharing those accurate numbers or not are a different thing. There is a blog out there, it's called Oryx, which tracks destroyed and captured vehicles. And they've got stuff on Afghanistan, but I'll leave a link below in the description. They're tracking the Ukraine war. And in their case, they only add to the list if they have photographic evidence of a vehicle or other evidence, which means that this is likely an undercount, but it is an actual supportable number. They list the manufacturer of the vehicle so you get an idea of what side experienced the loss, and they break it down, destroyed and damaged, or abandoned or captured. And I'm not going to go into extreme detail, so you should check it out. But the tally of Ukrainian losses, according to the Oryx, is about 540 vehicles, 77 which are tanks. For aircraft, there are 3 MiG-29s destroyed, 3 Su-27s, 5 Su-25 ground attack airplanes, and an AN-26 transport. So far the Oryx has photographic evidence, like I said, that's what they use, of 1,878 Russian armored vehicle losses, and break that down into 296 main battle tank losses. 126 destroyed, 125 captured, 41 abandoned. Finally, there's a report from the Ukrainian General Staff that Ural Vagon Zavod, that's the main Russian tank manufacturer, has shut down due to a lack of parts. The Russian Federation hasn't commented on that, but it's a believable thing in our whole supply chain nightmare worldwide. Apparently that factory produced a prototype, this is an interesting thing, of a new version of the T-80. It's called the T-80 UM2. And they deployed that tank with the Ford's 4th Guard tank army. And that was destroyed as part of a convoy on 3/17/22. Just all kinds of stuff. Well, that wraps up the Flywire's update number 3 of the Ukraine war. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time on Flywire.